We're ready for part 3 of our white barn piece. So in this video, we are going to paint the flowers. We're going to talk a little bit about painting some of those greens. I'm going to give you a couple of hints if you're not using the wood cutouts. Hopefully some tips that will make that easier for you. And then at the very end, I'm going to show you a little bit about the glass. And then we'll talk a little bit about the resin. I did not film the resining of this piece, mostly because it's huge and it's just hard to get everything in the camera. So since I filmed this piece, I've upgraded the camera settings. I'm sorry that for some of this, the angle of the camera isn't the best. But again, it's so big, so it's hard to capture all of it. So let's go ahead and get started with the video. I will be posting as an attachment a picture of my color worksheet. But basically what I've done down at the bottom here is just add in a some variations of the greens and just trying to I want the greens here to be pretty dark, but I do want to give some variation. So as the greens get up to the top with some of those little trying to think about what to call them. Some of the little sprays, some of the little areas where we will end up putting some beads, I let that green get very similar to the green that we used in the ground area under the barn. So I used a couple of different blues that are not on our limited palette. If anyone has any questions as you're doing yours about how to use the limited palette that we've talked about to mix some similar colors to what I'm using here, please let me know. I used some cobalt blue through here. I ended up using some of the cerulean blue to mix the purples. So I'm using a little filbert and I'm just going around redefining some of the darks. I didn't film all of painting this background, these background greens. It just takes a little bit of time, but once we put glass on the piece, much of this is not going to show. So just the big thing here is just adding in some variation in greens, letting it get a little bit lighter as it goes toward the top where the sun would naturally hit it more, and then letting it be quite dark at the bottom where everything is in shadow. If you are not using the wood cutouts, then this is the point where I would put the tracer back on. So at this point, you would have the sky and the barn and all of the background all done. Then once all of that is perfectly dry, put your tracer back on, use the transfer paper to trace in these flower designs. I think that that's really the easiest way, rather than trying to paint around all the flowers when you're painting the barn. Just go ahead and paint the barn like we did, and then trace in this flower design down at the bottom. So I really relaxed here and had a really good time just going slow, changing the variations of the green. So I used mostly the same greens that we talked about up in the trees. I just darkened them a little bit. So you can darken them with more of the blues. You can darken them with a little bit. I didn't do it for this piece. You could put some Quin Magenta if you wanted to darken them even more. Let's go forward a little bit. This is all just relaxing and painting. At the top there on the top left, I did let some of my strokes get a little bit sketchier as if there were more stalks and different things happening. So, in other words, rather than sort of a flat color, I let some of the streaky paint strokes go in there. So here I'm going back in and adding some of the darker areas where the wood cutout um, has an opening where the background shows through. I want it to be quite dark back in those openings. So if you didn't get yours quite dark enough when you were doing your first lay-in of the background, you can easily go in and darken those areas. So I spent a lot of time when I was painting the leaves on this piece. Like I said, you really don't need to. Um, however, I kind of like just working with my paintbrush. I think that the more time that you have um, using the paint, particularly here where I'm getting ready to start on the flowers, if you can you just be using the paint, be using the paintbrush, get a feel for things. It's kind of a little bit of a warm up in essence. But I will also point out, and this will be the same will be true if you're not using the wood cutouts. In general, if you're not sure what to paint first, then paint first what is furthest away from you. Because as I'm painting this background, if I come over the flower edge a little bit, it's fine. Painting the flowers on top will just naturally bring them forward a little bit. So there's no hard and fast rule, and I don't always paint what's farthest away, but if you're ever just wondering, if you're pondering what you should do, then that's a good rule of thumb. So again, for the lights, I'm using some of the same greens that I used before. I've talked a lot about how every time I go back to my palette, I'm remixing some color. I I I try to do that on purpose. It just adds great variation. But by using some of the same blues and the same yellows to mix these greens, we just harmonize it and make it all go together naturally. I'm gonna go forward a little bit. Remember, our light is coming from the far right side, almost in my mind as I was painting here, I was envisioning kind of a late afternoon low light coming across. So I'm thinking about that as I'm deciding um, which parts of these leaves might have a little bit more of a highlight. However, particularly in this piece where different things are shading and different leaves are peeking out of areas, we don't have to be um, overly worried about the light side and the shadow side. So now I'm going to start with painting the flowers. Um, I really had so much fun. And the wood cutouts, truly, if you've never tried the wood cutouts at all, um, get a small piece. The Pelican Bay piece is a great piece. The bigger pieces, the more layers, they're more expensive. This White Barn wood cutout takes quite a while on the laser, so it is a little bit more expensive than others, but the result that you get with the layering is incredible. but also the time that it saves you. If you're a selling artist, um, the wood cutouts will just really save you so much time. All the detail is there. All I have to do is go in and have fun painting. So this, I wanted my tulips to be um, a little bit of a pinky purple. So I'm using the cerulean blue and the quin magenta to make the purple. And then I can add in just a little bit more quin magenta or a little bit more of the phthalo blue for the places that I want to shadow. And I'm picking out something in my paint. I love the I love the filbert for this. I feel like one of the reasons why I often lean toward the using the filbert brushes is I feel like I can get a nice coat of paint down, um, not leave too much texture. I can use it easily to pull together between two colors. You can see me dipping into my extender. So if I feel like my paint is pulling too much, I can just dip just the tips of the tip of the bristles just into the extender. That will thin out the paint a little bit. Will also keep it a little bit wetter for a little bit longer. And I can pull those colors together a little bit. But I don't want to make it flat. I want to leave some of the variation. And just as a reminder, these wood cutouts have been covered with the GAC 100. That just is a nice protective barrier between the wood and the paint. If the wood would happen to have any oils or anything that might discolor the paint, that GAC 100 is a nice barrier, but it also is a nice surface to paint on. So it keeps the paint from soaking into the wood too much, just gives me a nicer surface to paint on. I did not prime these in any way. You certainly could. Um, I didn't struggle with it. So the wood cutouts, the wood that I use on the laser is pretty light colored. But if you wanted to not have to do quite as many layers of these of the purples, then you certainly could do any kind of a primer or paint the cutouts white before you start. For these purple tulips, I did Google purple tulips and just have just a color reference available to see. Um, if I can't recall at this moment if I had any of the purple tulips that were open source for commercial use. But if I do, I'll share them in the group so that you guys can see them. But basically, just Google any purple tulip or dark pink tulip. Just get an idea for where some of those striations in the color happen. And you can really build up the bowl shape of the tulip by um, adjusting your paint strokes. So the paint strokes around the right side of that big front petal that I just did, they'll curve sort of a backwards C on that side. On the left side, they will curve more as a C shape. And then in the center, those lines will go more straight up and down. So all of those brush strokes really, really help to build up that shape. And tulips are just, they have this beautiful bowl shape, and we really want to capture that. Let me go forward just a little bit. You could see me there, just darkening that mixture, adding in a little bit more of the blue. So pay close attention to the palette. And really, I have some days when I'm painting where I feel like I don't do as good of a job managing the palette. I try to really focus um, on managing the palette. And by that, I mean, I'm trying to manage that my paint doesn't dry too quickly. So I'm trying to be sure that I'm just dipping my brush into the extender medium anytime that I feel like it's um, dragging or thickening too much. But I also try to manage that pile of paint that I have. So you see within that one pile at the very top right, it's much more dark. Then I have the mid value, the more true purpley pink, and then at the far bottom, the lightest tone. So that evolves the longer that I paint, but I can keep mixing within those different areas to um, to alter and vary the color as I paint. This far left tulip, I wanted it to be quite dark. It's farthest away from the right side, which is where our light source is. Um, I wanted to give it a little bit of the impression that it's kind of back within the flowers. So my idea is to make it quite a bit darker than the first tulip that we just painted. You can see me there using my pinky to brace my hand. That's that's a great tip. Sometimes I'll bring my left hand up and set kind of touch on the canvas in a place that's dry, and then rest my wrist on my left hand. So I came in with just a little bit more of the Quin Magenta just to give it a little pop of color. Just keep playing back and forth between your values. If you feel like it got too light, add in a little bit of dark, then dip into the extender and brush along that edge of the paint stroke that you just did to pull the colors together. For my piece, I chose to only put glass on the flowers. Um, my piece is big. I think I'm trying to remember. I always forget. I think it's 30 inches wide by 24 inches tall. So when you go to resin a piece that is this big, that's a lot of space to manage. So I was really glad that I only had the resin, sorry, only had the glass on that bottom portion, because for the barn itself and the rest of the background, I could just spread a thin layer of resin back there. I ended up getting very close to the end of my resin working time, which is I generally try to not go past 40 minutes by very much. And I will say, since I've mentioned that, the hazard of going much past 40 minutes is that any resin that you drizzle on your piece after that has a much more likely chance of showing ridges and marks when the resin cures. So if you were to kind of look across the surface of your resin, you would have a more of a chance of seeing some ridges. I kind of equate it to kind of waves across the resin. It's very subtle and probably doesn't bother anyone else, but I have noticed in um, some of my pieces where I've drizzled on paint later that that you can pick that out just a little bit. So I'm going to move on to what I'm calling cone flowers. I know that they're similar. They're not exactly cone flowers, but um, I liked the shape of them. So I wanted these to be um, really, really dark purple. Again, I Googled a picture of purple cone flowers, and I have that reference up to the side um, so I can see it. And painting these was a dream on the wood cutouts because I can put in these darks, but still be able to see the the detail lines, the basically, in essence, the tracer lines. So if you are not using the wood cutouts and you're painting along with your flowers, you've set in your darks, and you feel like um, you kind of lost the shape of the flower, let it dry and just set your tracer back over the top of it and trace over it again. There's nothing at all wrong with coming back in and doing another tracing. So you can, as you, if you're using the printed tracer, when you set it on your piece, have some registration marks or have some um, hints to yourself about exactly where that goes so that if you have to place it back down onto your piece, you can easily tell that you have it in the right spot. Many artists will tape it along the top and then just flip the tracer back off of it when they're painting, or flip it back down onto the piece if they need to retrace something. So the steps here for the purple coneflowers are exactly the same. You saw me add in the darkest purples. And now I'm just coming in with a little bit of a lighter mixture. I know that um, sometimes we struggle with feeling like we need to blend. And I know that I talk about this probably on each video that I do, but um, don't get frustrated. You can see, looking at this coneflower that I'm painting, that it's a mess. It doesn't really have much shape yet. It looks like my baby granddaughter painted it. But that's okay. I'm just getting the darks in, getting a little bit of the light in, beginning to build the shape just enough that I can see the petals and see it coming together. After we get the first coat down, then we can go in and make some adjustments. For my wood cutouts, across this entire piece, I didn't paint, or I'll back up. I didn't purposefully paint any of the sides of my wood cutouts. So just the normal edge is what I left there, the lasered edge. If a little bit of paint did get across to the sides, I also didn't worry about that. At this stage, when you're starting to paint the flowers, now I'm starting to pay more attention to those edges. Um, I'm trying not to leave any holidays. Um, Holidays are any areas that show through the background. So I'm trying to concentrate on making sure all of that wood background is covered. And you can certainly go back in with more of your background greens and handle that too. But it's just nice at this stage if you're starting to think about it. So on this right coneflower, I'm going to be doing the same basic thing that I did with the tulips. I'm going to let this one be just a little bit lighter than the one on the far left. So I'm going in and painting in where I think the shadows of the petals will be. So wherever a petal is going back behind another one, I'm adding a shadow. Wherever it's coming in front of another petal, I'm making it a little bit lighter. Sorry, I bumped the camera. I hope you can pick out the variations in the colors that are coming in as I go to the palette to mix and then come back. You can see some of those areas are a little bit more of the quin magenta pink kind of showing through. Part of that happens because I don't wash my brush very often, and I like what happens um, if you have a habit of continuously washing your brush. I would like to challenge you to do that less. And the benefit is that every time that I reach in to mix in more quin magenta, and I just when I say mix, I kind of just lightly marble it together. Marble's not the right word, but I don't thoroughly mix anything to a single color. For this piece, I did mix a um, kind of a larger pile of purple. I knew I was going to be using a lot of purple, so it's fine to do that. But then each time that I reach in with my paintbrush, I'm changing the color a little bit. It's a little bit mottled on my brush. It's not thoroughly mixed. Because I'm not washing my brush, I'm still getting a lot of those colors working too. So um, I just kind of naturally get that variation in color because I'm not washing my brush. Of course, there are times when you're going to paint something and it's important to have a clean brush. For instance, I wouldn't want to, with this purple in my brush, dip into the green and start painting some of the lighter green at the top. Um, that would be a mess. So of course, then it's nice to have a clean brush. But for all of these purples, I'm just using the same brush. The hazard of using the same brush is that acrylics dry relatively quickly. So if you're feeling like your paintbrush is getting a little gummed up, is drying out, then you can take a break and wash your brush and start over. You can also just dip into that extender liquid and run that through your brush, pinch wipe your brush out, and then get started again. The nice thing about the extender liquid is it's going to get up closer to the ferrule of the brush and keep the paint from drying up there into the base of those bristles. Once paint dries there, it it kind of creates a problem with the brush itself. You'll start to notice that the bristles of the brush will separate more. You'll have a harder time getting the bristles to come back together. So it's one of the reasons why I love using really inexpensive brushes. Um, I don't have to be overly protective of them. I use them and abuse them and scrub them into the surface, and I just don't worry about them. I've known artists before who are very particular, so particular that if you would go over to paint with them, they would have certain brushes that only they can use. Like, you're not allowed to touch their brushes because they're expensive and very treasured and fancy. I just like not having that. I like to just um, use my brushes. In fact, my grandchildren come down and paint with my paintbrushes, and that's perfectly fine. I think it's just so much more fun to paint that way. So much more freeing than feeling like you have to be super careful with a brush you spent a bunch of money on. So for I'm so sorry, I'm still dealing with a cold, so please excuse me. This little bud of the coneflower that's coming underneath, um, this particular flower, the middle wood cutout covers over some. So I'm keeping that in mind as I'm painting here, letting it get be a little bit darker of a purple where it would be shaded by that other flower. I'm going to go forward a little bit. You can see there that that flower went together really quickly, and really just with some strokes of some darker purple, some strokes of some lighter purple. You really don't have to pay any attention to the detail of the flower there at all. With just some very loose paint strokes, you can have that flower done very quickly. So now coming to the front flowers, my idea for this piece was that these flowers were going to be um, mostly white. I'm using the pink as sort of the shadow color for these. There's a lot of options, and um, I've seen some paintings that people have done, and um, it's so fun to see the different variations when people go a different direction. If you wanted to do, you could do these white flowers with shadows of gray. That would work too. So I'm just coming in, laying in those shadow areas, um, and I'm not worrying about if this dries at all, because again, this is just the first look, just the first layer. This petal at the bottom has a little bit of a fold over, so we can achieve that look by the shadow behind it, the petal at the top is the same way. I like those little folds in flowers, I do that a lot in my drawings. So notice the brush strokes here. Again, the direction of your brush strokes makes a big difference. So I'm following the lines that are on the tracer or on the wood cutout. The more you can sweep in long strokes like that, the better that you're going to be able to pull the colors together. So you'll see me taking sort of longer sweeping strokes. And that's kind of the nice thing after you've painted for a while. This is what I was talking about when I was taking the time painting some of those leaves. I've warmed up a little bit. I've used my paintbrush. I've done some of those sweeping strokes and I've kind of gotten the feel for it. I think that warming up when you're painting is not talked about very much. And it sounds a little silly when you talk about, I'm going to do a painting warm up, but it really is. And I think that all of you will have noticed that in your own painting. When you first sit down to paint, you feel a little bit unsure, you feel a little bit tight with your paint strokes, but the longer that you sit at the canvas, the longer that you paint, your brush strokes become a little bit freer, they seem a little bit easier. That's just because you've warmed up. So many times in the pieces that I'm painting, I'll start out painting something that I feel the most confident about. So that's true with these flowers. I was a little bit more unsure of um, exactly what I wanted these kind of big floppy open flowers to be. So I started with something that I was more sure of, and that was the tulips. You also see me here just focusing on this one flower. Because I'm not certain yet of exactly the look that I'm going to be getting, by just doing this one flower, I can kind of work out some of those things and then move on to the others. Um, but also, as we're working with the acrylics, it's um, it's generally easier to work on one section at a time. I don't know if you noticed there when I turned the paintbrush with the filberts, it's so nice to be able to use it on its flat, but then also be able to turn it more on its side to use more of a chisel edge. So as you're painting, I hope that you're reminding yourself. I had an art teacher once that she called it drive the brush. And um, I always thought it sounded a little silly when she would say it at first, but then the more that I painted, the more I realized the importance of that, of remembering that you have this tool in your hand and there are lots of ways to use it. So, sometimes we'll rock it back and forth to get a different look, or like I said, turn the filbert on its side more to get more of a streaky, um, thin line with it. And in these petals where I am looking for those kind of thin striations of the paint, it's um, it's really helpful to use the different sides of the brush. So you saw me there dip into the extender and then pinch my brush out. I'm doing that just to um, soften the lines that I put in just a little bit. I want the streakiness to be there, but I don't want it to be um, too busy or too crazy. So at this point on this petal that I'm working on, where I'm bringing in the lights, that purple that I put in before is dry. But as I run out of paint on my brush, as I go down into that shadow area, it allows some of that first shadow to show through. So if your white is going too far, if your white is covering more than you want it to cover, pinch out the brush, take most of the paint out of it, dip your brush in extender or airbrush medium, and then pull back over that area. That's another part of driving the brush. Um, being aware of how much paint is in the brush and always watching what's happening with each stroke that you make. If the paint isn't doing what you want it to be doing, it is either because you have too much paint in the brush or because the paint in your brush is too thick. So anytime that you're struggling or feeling frustrated, change something. Um, clean out your brush or thin your paint a little bit. Sorry, I keep bumping into the microphone. Hopefully it's not making a loud sound. I've been trying to play this flower pretty much in real time so you can see how it comes together. Of course, the other three flowers are the same process. Um, we want them to be, even though they're the same process, we want them to have a little bit of variation. We don't want them to be exactly the same. At that particular petal, you could see that I really took out too much of the shadow. That's okay. I never worry about that. You could see how I just dipped into a little bit more of the purple color, come back in and add a little bit back in. I like those layers. I think that um, new acrylic painters, I think that layers is maybe the thing that they don't do enough of. So I hope that through watching some of my tutorials that I can really get across the idea that um, to embrace the layers, to really celebrate going back in and adding in more layers. So you can see here this just adding in more pops of the purple. Just there's very little paint in my brush, using very little pressure on my brush. You can see how lightly I'm holding it. Just adding back in just almost some detail of little flecks of color within the petals. But I'll go back and forth quite a few times. I'll You put in the darks, put in some highlights, go back in, add in some more darks, go back in and add in some more highlights. And each one of those layers that we do brings it to life. So I hope you'll do that. I hope that you'll um, I hope that you'll embrace the layers. It's easy to think that I watched a tutorial and it seemed like it came together really easily. And here I am on my fourth layer going back. That's okay. Just enjoy the process and do the layers because it's worth it. This piece is is stunning and it deserves the time to build and develop these flowers fully. I do want to point out that on a flower like this, where I want some bright, almost white highlights, the first layers that I'm doing pretty much up until this point, my paint is all relatively thin paint. By that I mean it's it's not leaving marks of brush strokes. It's just the base layer. Once I get the shape of it built and I have the shadows that I feel like I want, when I come back in with my final highlights, that's when I'll use much thicker paint where maybe some of the brush strokes show through a little bit better. So again, that's a process of building the layers. I don't have to get those final bright highlights. I build up to it, and then at the very last step, and as you know, if you watched my videos, that's my favorite. Going back in and adding in those final darkest shadows and the final brightest highlights is is my favorite part. For that stroke, you could see when I made that paint stroke that I felt like it got a little bit too blue. Um, I don't worry about that too much. I just go back to my palette and mix it a little bit more purple. Um, but anytime I go to my palette to pick up more paint or mix more paint, as I'm doing right here, now when I go back to the canvas, when I go back to painting, I'll be very um, watchful of that color on the first few strokes that I make. Once I feel comfortable with that color, then I'll be more bold with some of the paint strokes that I make. So I want this little flap of the petal to really show. I can make that happen by darkening the shadow underneath of it. Sometimes we think, oh, I want that to be brighter, so I need to add lighter paint. Um, Often it's the opposite. If you want a part to be lighter, then darken what's beside it. So as I first come in, adding in a little bit more of those shadows, you can see that those first strokes that I made can kind of look like an outline. So what I've done here is cleaned my brush and I'm coming back in with just a little bit of paint on my brush, just pulling that together a little bit, making it so it's not like an outline. Always having a dream on the other side of my desk. I hope you can see there how light the pressure is, just very lightly going along, letting some of the striations of the paint show. I'm gonna go forward just slowly, just to show the rest of this petal coming together. This is where I'm coming back in, adding some of those thicker strokes of white paint. So when I come back in with these thicker, bolder highlights, I'm not thinning the paint as much. And this is one of the reasons why I really like to use the heavy body paints. Um, I can come in with this real thick paint that makes a real bold impact. Where I want it to be thinner, it's easy to thin it out, but where I want the thick paint to be, it's just very dramatic. And you can see now as I'm doing some of this, how those shadows that I put in before are getting settled in a little bit better. It's not looking like as much of an outline. It's looking like part of the petal. And so I think you can see what I was talking about before, how many times I go back and forth between um, adding in the lights, adding in the shadows, adding in more lights, a few more shadows. I'll go forward just slowly again. With these other petals, it's the very same thing, adding in some of the thick paint. Here you can already see that I'm changing up a little bit how I'm doing this middle flower, varying it a little bit by allowing a little bit more of the Quin Magenta to show in. Um, the Quin Magenta is a little bit of a warmer tone than that purple, so I can give a little bit of the feeling that the sun or light is hitting that. I didn't film all of painting the petals. That's why you saw it kind of jump ahead really quickly right there. So now I'm just going in, adding in some centers of the flowers. You can darken the purple and then add some of your browns in. I used Van Dyke Brown. If you don't have Van Dyke Brown, you could use the burnt sienna with some black. And I'm being pretty meticulous about these centers. I know that I'll probably add some beads and things to the center. It's going to cover up much of this painting. I'm going to go forward a little bit. I think that the big thing here for these centers is just allowing there to be some variation in the color. You could see with that first one, I was a little bit more careful, a little bit more calculated. Once I felt like I knew kind of what I was going for, then for these other two flowers, the process goes much quicker. So that is all for that video. For the next video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the glass that I'm going to add. I will be, for in Shelley Parker Art, I will be doing a class on just cutting glass and talk about some of the things that I like to use, some of the tools that I use. Um, but and I'll also do that for resin. I'll just do kind of an overview of resin and glass. But here I have a Dollar Tree bowl, and I've used alcohol ink to color the bowl. So I really like the Tim Holtz alcohol inks or the Ranger inks. I feel like they're a good quality ink. They work well with the resin. So I used um, the Gumball and the Fiesta color, and I used a gloved hand and just smeared the paint on the inside and outside of the glass until I got the color that I wanted. And you could see when I was holding up that bowl that it's quite it's very pink. But when you put it on the petals, on these dark purple petals, it really um, it really adds this amazing pop of color that was just so pretty. So you know, don't be afraid to try something bold. Cut a few pieces of a glass and um, try it out. Lay it on your piece and see how it works. The other thing is, once you pour the resin, be watching that area again and making sure that once the resin is on it, that it is giving the look that you want. So I'm going to go forward a little bit. I will point out here that I did go in and the little flowers that you see in the background, I did make those sort of a fun little white and blue. I'm pointing to one there. I used the same blues that I used in the barn, which again is a great way to harmonize our piece. But they're very loose. They're just I just barely hinted at them. I'm gonna go forward just a little bit. Um, I did go in, I'm pointing to a couple of pieces there. I did go in and push in a couple of extra spacers. Um, I felt like when I got to this stage and I was looking at the I try to be very careful, looking under, making sure that everything is um, stabilized enough. So you can certainly push in more spacers if you feel like that you have an area where maybe something is just a little bit too fragile. It's certainly okay to do that. You want to be careful, of course, because that super glue is is a mess. You could see me there pointing to the barn uh, color. Again, just re-emphasizing that we can harmonize our colors. So I took a few pieces of purple crushed glass and I added them into this sort of the negative area around the flowers just to give a little bit of indication that maybe there were some little flowers back there. I liked how that looked. Um, it blends in nicely with the resin on top. And then for these little beads at the very tops of these little seed pods or whatever these little flowers are at the top, I used some of the little AB. I'm gonna call them beads, but they don't have a hole in them. They're not a true bead. But I like the AB glass. I love how it looks with resin. Come forward just a little bit. Here are the beads that I used in the centers. I like that mix. So when I did this piece, I have so many things going on with the wood cutouts, and I wanted to keep some of these seed beads from just flying around. So what I decided to do was use just a little bit of the clear school glue and on a paper plate, pour some of that over the beads. I've got these little spoons. I think those little spoons came with a mica powder order that I got at one point. But you just mix the glue in, and that way, when I place it on my piece, they're staying exactly where I want them to be. It it just keeps you from playing the chase game the with the beads. I really loved this technique. I had never tried this before, but it really helped so much keep the beads where I wanted them to be. I'm gonna go forward a little bit. I did that same technique with the AB beads that I showed just a moment ago. Um, Here I went to sort of some bronze beads, same thing, just added some glue, and I'm putting them in the centers of the cone flowers. This picture shows the sea bell nippers. Um, I really do like them. I talk about them a lot in the videos that I do. Um, I do think it's good to have a couple of different kinds of nippers because you can get different cuts. It's just like a knife in the kitchen. Um, and I'm sorry for the video here. I had a cable stretched across my studio, and the cable just didn't seem to be working perfectly. So that's the little glitch that you see sometimes. But on the nippers, it's kind of like driving your brush. You try different things with your nippers. See what happens when you reach further into your glass for cuts, or when you cut closer to the edge. See what happens when you hold the nippers more vertical to the glass that you're cutting, and see what happens when you turn the nippers just slightly. The thing about the seabell nippers that I'm holding here, that those rubber stoppers kind of keep the nippers from turning as much as I sometimes like. I'm nipping the glass over my empty bin. Sometimes you'll see me nip over my colored glass bin. When you nip over an empty bin, you can more easily find the cuts that you've just made. When you cut yours, particularly if you're cutting this type of glass that has been colored by alcohol ink, please don't cut it over your piece like I'm doing here. It's just um, it's just impossible for me to show you without doing it myself, but particularly with this colored glass. And the reason that I'm emphasizing that so much is I ended up having a spot up in the sky area that was pink. And the only thing I can think is that it came from a little fleck that came off of this pink glass that I was cutting. Now, the bowl that I'm cutting here, even though I colored it with alcohol ink, it had been weeks before this that I colored it. There I'm kind of showing how you can use a sanding stone to get any real dangerous bits off of your glass. And again, that's another area where with this colored glass, I could have gotten a little fleck of that color onto my painting. So don't do that over your piece. I don't sand all of my glass at all. It would just take forever. But if there's particularly a piece that has a dangerous shard on the side of it, then I'll spend the time to sand that. I'm going to go forward. I'm just setting in some of this pink glass. I want to make sure that you can really see what that looks like on these petals. It looks a little crazy at this point, and what you really have to remember is that the resin is going to pull it all together magically. So don't be too concerned about that very bright color. But you can see that light pink vase. It's very translucent. You can see through it very easily, but I put a couple of pieces of that in, and I really liked how that looked too. Here's another variation of glass. You can see above it my purple glass bin. I love having my extra glass saved by color. So when I'm doing a piece, many times I can go to those bins where I've just got leftovers, and I can cut that glass and use it on my piece. So yeah, I liked that really well. My daughter is a bartender, so she brings me these dark green bottles. I can't remember what liquor is in this one. If anybody has a question as you're watching what bottle that is, make sure you message me. I have another one that's not cut, so I can find out what it is, but I can't remember at this moment. So I'm going to be using some of that along the petals, but then right there you could see me hold up a blue vase. I'm adding a little bit of the blue glass too, and it worked amazing. Again, because that glass was so light and so transparent, the resin just pulls it all together. But I liked I like that variation. So to start with this glass, you can see now I've changed nippers. I have my Laponnet nippers, and I'm trying to get this thick top off of this. I wouldn't cut the first way that I was holding it, so I just changed it, just changed the angle just to get the edge off. So I'll go all the way around the edge. You can see me there tipping it down into my bin. I'm trying to keep the glass from flying around my piece in my studio. So by really turning the nippers down into my bin, I can aim those pieces down. So you just have to kind of methodically work all the way around the rim, just get all of those pieces off. And then the nippers begin to fit a little bit more into the neck of that glass. And I save all of these pieces. At some point, I'm going to have enough glass pieces saved that I'm going to have to start throwing some away. But for the piece that I'm doing right here, these top pieces that I'm cutting off right now really aren't what I'm looking for, but I'll save them in my green glass bin and be able to use them on something in the future. And by doing that, like this this bottle will do many, many pieces. It doesn't take a lot of glass generally for the types of things that I'm doing. So I'm finally getting down, just working around the neck of this bottle. And you can see that cut. What happened was the nippers were in a tight enough space that it pushed the side of the bottle out. Um, that was fine for what I was wanting to get to this um, glass that had a larger, rounder diameter. But the inside of my bottle was a little bit dirty, so I am taking a cloth and just making sure that I wipe it off. Just clean it a little bit. You can get out a little bit of alcohol if you need to, or a baby wipe to wipe it. But what I was going to say about the bottle breaking is, um, for anyone who maybe is a little bit hesitant about cutting glass, anytime I cut a new vase or a new bottle, the first cut I always am very careful of because glass is moody and different, and you can't always predict what each type of glass is going to do. But particularly with a bottle like that, just be ready. So by being over that bin, um, even though it broke in a way that I wasn't expecting, I was being careful about how I was aiming the nippers and how I was holding the glass. You can see that I don't wear any protection on my hands. It's just too difficult for me to hold the glass and place it where I want it. That piece isn't laying the way that I want it to lay, so I can just nip it a little bit. But I don't mind some of the dimension. I don't mind the glass standing up a little bit. I do try to be very careful with how glass stands up to make it as safe as possible to be around, but I like the dimension. So you can see me here setting the green glass beside some of that light blue glass that I laid in. And that variation is so interesting to see in the final piece. So anytime that you're cutting glass for any of your pieces, I hope that you'll just have in your head over and over again, variation, variation, variation. And you might not originally think about adding blue glass, but you can see looking at those leaves right there, how good those two look together, even here before resin. So now I began to experiment a little bit with the glass that I was going to put on the big flowers. And I wasn't really sure when I started. My original thought was just thin shards of white glass. I'm going to back up just a little bit. I was pointing out again the beads that I used on the little seed buds there. This is a AB glass, and I'll put a link to this glass in the Facebook group. So if you are not in our Facebook group for Patreon members, I hope that you will come over there and join. I try to invite everyone when they join. But I did use a little bit of that AB glass on a few of those little the tiny flowers, the little blue and white flowers. I didn't spend a lot of time on it, but I just gave a little accent of glass on a few of those pieces. So I'm going to go forward a little bit. These were a great find. These are kind of a faceted, bronzy bead. These beads came with a strand of beads that my mother-in-law gave me, but I loved how they turned out on the little berry pods that are around the piece. And when I was doing the piece, I wished I had more because I loved them so much. I would have put more on. You can just they just look perfect. And again, variation. So the texture of those beads, the roundness of those beads, um, it's just a perfect addition to everything else that's going on in the piece. Now it's Higgins' turn to have a dream. You can use a little dot of school glue if you want to hold those in place, just like I did with the other beads. The only thing to remember is you want to give the school glue plenty of time to dry. I like to wait until the next day if I use it. Doesn't always happen. Which piece was it recently that I said that about? I think it might have been on the Midnight Crow piece. And luckily it worked out. I lucked out. But you want to make sure that there's no moisture around your resin because um, it has the potential to make your resin cloudy, and we don't want that. So I showed a little bit of the pink glass. I used some purple glass on the tulips as well. But I have such a I love the painting that I have on the tulips, and I didn't want to cover it completely. And I think that that's why I like to use the transparent glass so much. It's it adds a nice dimension and sparkle without fully covering everything that everything that you're doing. So that is everything. Experiment with the glass that you want to use on the flowers. Um, I ended up coming in with some bigger chunks of glass. I I experimented a little bit with some textured glass. Um, I really liked just the untextured glass. I really liked the fact that the glass showed the painting underneath. You know, you can see just in the picture how much of a sparkle that there is, but you can still see the painting underneath. So, like I mentioned before, I had originally thought that I was going to do just little thin cuts of glass, and I ended up liking the thicker chunks. What I want to say to you is, as you're cutting glass, particularly for those bigger flower pieces, you don't have to feel like it needs to perfectly match the petal. Don't get frustrated trying to cut glass. So, like in this petal here, there's a piece of glass here, there's a piece of glass here, there's a piece of glass here. And I just keep placing glass until I have the look that I want. But when I pour the resin over the top of it, it almost gives it the look that it's one single piece of glass. So the more that you pour resin, the more that you do glass and resin art, the more comfortable that you'll be with that. But don't get frustrated. One of the things that I've heard students say is that they don't feel like they're getting cuts that are smooth enough. They feel like there's some jagged edges. If you look closely at my cuts, there's a lot of the pieces of glass that are jagged, but the resin pulls it together. The resin makes it look to you like, when you see my piece, that I was a master at cutting this glass, and it's all perfect. And it just isn't. You can also see, let me see if I can get, you can see a little bit of the AB glass on those little blue and white flowers that I was talking about over here. But you certainly have a lot of options with the glass. Vary your glass. Use different purples. Use some pinks. Pinks can be hard to find in glass, and that's why it's nice to use the alcohol ink. I went ahead and pulled my alcohol ink out to show the two colors that I used. So color some glass, and then the possibilities are endless. But like I said, if you color the glass when you cut it, make sure that you stay away from your piece. What I ended up having to do, the pink part was, it's so hard to do. The pink part was like way over here, right beside the silo in the sky. And I painted over it. I used the GAC 100 and then painted over that. The great thing was I still had my palette. So I was able to have basically my same mixtures still saved on my palette. Every time I painted it, I would come back in about 10 or 15 minutes and look at it, and that pink would come back to the surface again. I would paint it and seal it and paint it, and I tried titanium white because titanium white is the most opaque color that we have on our palette, or one of the most opaque colors. I tried that. I was so frustrated. I ended up having to take a palette knife and completely scoop out that part of the paint and repaint over it. And that's dangerous to do because once you scoop out that paint, now you have potentially kind of a divot in your paint. And no matter how much you paint over it, there's a potential that it would, those levels would show different. So I was very careful. I tried to keep the scooping it out as small as I could. And then I went back and painted over it, finally conquered it. But again, I think it's one of those things that nobody else would have probably noticed. For me, I had so many hours into this piece. I was so in love with it. And I knew it would always bother me to have that little pink blob in the sky. And when I say blob, it was little, littler than a seed bead, but it was noticeable to me. So I was willing to not let it beat me and keep going until I got it. So I hope that you loved this class. Like I said, I didn't film the resin of this piece. I will say that you want to be aware, especially if you're doing a big one like this. This was probably the first piece that I've ever done where I felt like I was really getting toward the end of the working time of my resin. So I started out like I always do, adding the resin to the flowers and the places where the bulk of my glass was. And then once I had that situated, then I resined the barn. And like I said, I liked the fact that I didn't have to worry about any glass back there. It was very easy to use my flat spreader and just spread it across. As always, when you're using wood cutouts or wood substrates, or even on your canvases, if you're resining to the outside edge, you want to babysit that a little bit. Go back toward the end of the working time of your resin and re-hit some of those areas all along all of the edges. What I have found is that if the resin is too thin on any edge piece, the resin will pull back toward the bulk of the resin and away from the area that doesn't have enough resin. So that's often along those edges. So in the windows of the barn, down in the openings by the flowers, I just used a gloved hand and spread it around in there. I didn't want the openings of the barn windows to fill in completely. So I was very careful to just use my finger and kind of scoop some of that resin out, just so that in the texture, in the layers of the dimension, you could still see the open windows. Um, I did make sure to go in and at the very tops of all the flowers, I got on the other side of my piece so that I could look underneath and make sure that resin got under those areas enough that anyone else looking at the piece later wouldn't see something that seemed unfinished there. However, all along the bottom where these wood cutouts are, I didn't add any resin underneath of those cutouts. I just left those as is. So I hope that that gives you a couple of little hints about adding the resin. Um, like I said, I'm going to be doing a separate class just on some resin basics, a little class just on some cutting glass basics, just so that it's here for you guys. You guys can refer back to it. But really, the main thing with resin is measure carefully, and particularly for a piece like this, measure carefully. Remind me to go back to that because I have another little thing about this. One, measure carefully. Two, have everything in place. Have your spreaders, have a little skewer, to help you reach underneath of some of those areas. Have some shop towels that you have pre-soaked with alcohol so you can wipe the sides and different areas. Just try to have everything in place so that you're not scrambling. By the time that you have your hands covered with resin, you just don't want to have to be digging to find something. So to go back to measuring, for this piece, I mixed a lot of resin. And like I said, this piece is a 30 by 24, I think. So I just looked it up on KS Resin website and mixed the resin. When you're mixing such a bulk of resin for a big piece, triple check your measuring cups to make sure that what you're mixing is the right measurement. So I ordered some larger cups, some larger mixing cups, because I just hadn't done a giant piece before. I just didn't have anything. I ordered them from a reputable company that I trusted and decided just on a whim that I was going to double check. So I put 16 ounces of water in one, measured that out, measured out the same up to the 32 ounces, or I'm terrible at math, but added it in so that I could measure the 32 ounces. When I compared it, it was off by a lot, by like 3 ounces. So what I ended up doing, I used the same measuring cups. I hope that that made sense. I don't feel like I described that very well. Check your measurements. But what I ended up doing was I did use the cups, but I just put 16 ounces in of the resin, and then in a separate second cup, measured the same amount of the hardener, and then I combined the two. For small pieces, I never measure separately and then combine. I always pour into the same container to measure. And I'm using 16 ounces off the top of my head. I can't remember how many ounces that I used. Again, if you have a problem finding that, let me know. I'm happy to help you. Um, but because the resin that we used all across the top is so thin, um, you probably won't need as much as KS resin says, but I like to have more resin mixed than less. So I just have the little molds set out so that I can make some little fun things to include with orders. But be particularly careful, especially on a piece like this where you've invested so much time. You've got an investment in the wood cutouts and the glass. It's good to double, triple, quadruple check that resin and make sure. The other thing that you want to be very careful of when mixing a large batch of resin is that you mix it thoroughly enough. So many times I'm just measuring out 8 ounces of resin or 4 ounces of resin. So it's pretty easy to make sure when you're mixing that you've got it mixed well enough. With a larger batch of resin, um, even though KS resin says to mix it 4 minutes, I would mix it more. Just make sure that you get it fully incorporated. That's a little bit of an arm workout by the time you get done mixing it for about 5 minutes. Um, you're tired. It's a lot of mixing. So I hope that all of that helps. And if you have any questions as you get started on yours, either message me in our Patreon group, just tag me and post a question, or comment on Patreon. I'm happy to help you there. You can send me a private message to Shelley Mercer Parker on Facebook. So I answer those pretty quickly, usually. So it's a really fun piece. It's definitely a showstopper. I get to take it back upstairs now and hang it back on my wall since we're all finished with this class. But I hope that you loved it. I hope you'll try it. I think that there are a lot of great techniques in this class. So yeah, give it a try.